Good morning, everybody. You guys can talk to me, that's okay. I like it. It's really wonderful to be here, and I hope that I keep you entertained for the next hour, but I'm gonna warn you now that I'm gonna ask you to talk to me just a little bit. As Leanne mentioned, I did get in last night after a 28-hour journey, and I am pumped to be here. So let me tell you a little bit about what I do. I am the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Participatory Budgeting Project, and my boss, Josh Lerner, he says that my job is to win over people's hearts and minds. No pressure. But what I like to think of my work as is really an opportunity to empower people that matter, to remind folks that they matter. And we do that through participatory budgeting. And I consider myself a bit of a recovering government employee. I worked in local government for about 15 years, and I'm not 30 yet. So I started when I was a teenager. And through that experience, I learned that young people have a voice and can truly make a difference in government. During my tenure working at the City of Boston for the Mayor of Boston, I became the Executive Director of the Division of Youth Engagement and Employment when I was about 23 years old. At that point, I was overseeing a budget of about $4.5 million. My job was to employ young people across the city, so I oversaw internationally acclaimed employment program where we employed the most young people per capita of any city in the United States. Annually, that was about 4,000 young people. I oversaw a resource center for young people. I oversaw what's called the Mayor's Youth Council, so all civic engagement initiatives. In short, my job was to oversee all things youth and advise the mayor on youth-related efforts in the city. And so in that role, I launched what is now known as Youth Lead the Change, the country's first youth-focused participatory budgeting effort, which I'll describe in a couple minutes. But first, let me just tell you a little bit about the Participatory Budgeting Project, and I hope that you guys have an opportunity to check out some of our resources online. But this is a new organization, so to come from a space where I worked for a place that's literally existed for hundreds of years and go to a space that was founded in 2009 and incorporated as a nonprofit in 2011 is a bit different. And we're creating an opportunity in the United States that isn't present in many other spaces. And that's why I was so excited to join this team after working with them for a couple years doing some of this work in Boston. And so who knows what participatory budgeting is? Great, some people. And I imagine that this is also a new concept for some other folks. So I'm going to pause for a moment and show you guys a short video to kind of sum this up.
Right, if you live in this community and you pay taxes, come out and vote, decide how your tax dollars get spent.
Participatory budgeting gives people real power over real money to make the decisions that affect their lives. It's a democratic process in which ordinary community members directly decide how to spend part of the public budget.
Oh, this is different because you're actually voting for where the money is going to be spent instead of allowing them to decide where to spend the money.
Who knows better about their community than the people that live in their community?
Not be afraid of the big words, participatory budgeting. It sounds boring, but it's the opposite of that.
So how does it work? First, people brainstorm ideas. They come together in meetings and assemblies and start to think of what kinds of projects they would like to see in their neighborhood.
We had to think big. We have $1 million that we could use, so we can fund parks, health issues, streets.
Volunteers work with experts to turn people's initial ideas into full project proposals.
We started, we made about 40 projects, and so we had a series of budget delegate meetings, and we narrowed down the list into about 4 or 5 projects.
We met with the Parks Department and we talked about what we wanted to see change in some of the parks and how we were going to work with them.
What are the real needs of the community if you only have a certain amount of money? What is it that you can do that's going to benefit as many people as possible?
I'm dreaming of new benches, modern benches. Seniors have nowhere to go. displays at bus shelters throughout the district, and it will tell people when their next bus is due to arrive.
We're asking for a projector and 30 Mac laptops.
State-of-the-art teen fitness center.
To put solar panels on a firehouse.
After volunteers share the top projects, the community gets ready to vote.
It's a way of validating every voice in our community and saying, you know what, whatever your position is, you live in our community, you have a right to decide, and that me as a representative and government should respond and should listen to that voice. Anybody could vote in this process, immigrants, whether you're documented or not, young people that normally don't get to vote.
Most people, they don't even know that 16-year-olds can come out here and vote today. Some of them are really surprised. They said, really? I said, yes. They have a voice.
The projects with the most votes get funded.
The Red Hook Library Community Garden. Right here.
The projects are then implemented over the next few years. And the following year, the process starts again. People brainstorm new ideas, turn them into new projects, vote on them, and fund more improvements for their community. PB becomes part of the budget process. It becomes a new way of governing.
I think this is like the greatest wave of democracy coming into the United States. It started in Porto Alegre, Brazil in 1989.
From there, it spread all over Latin America to over 1,500 cities around the world. In Toronto, public housing tenants have decided how to spend millions of dollars on improvements to their buildings. City council members in Chicago, New York, and other cities have engaged thousands of residents in allocating discretionary funds. Entire cities have launched PB, such as in Vallejo, California, for funds from a sales tax, and in Boston for youth funds. Even schools and universities have used PB.
This was a great opportunity for you to be a part of government and better the city you live in. Who wouldn't want to take advantage of that?
You're creating a more educated platform of voters overall. So I think this can only be good for the big project of democracy.
It's not bad, right? So that's pretty much how we implement participatory budgeting in the United States, in the areas where we provide technical assistance. So just to summarize it one more time, and the icon that's not in front of you right now is the first step of this is actually we form a steering committee of residents, and potentially community-based organizations and other folks that govern this process, that write the rules for how participatory budgeting is going to work in a particular space. And then we go out to community and gather ideas, sometimes thousands of ideas. And then it's time for the hard work of developing those ideas into concrete proposals that can be present on a ballot. After that happens, we go out to a vote. And then this, I think, is probably the most important part, is the projects with the most votes are implemented. So during this proposal development phase, it's really important that whatever makes it onto the ballot is feasible, is going to impact that community, and hopefully meets equity criteria. And before I go on, what we're talking about really is redefining how democracy is practiced, redefining democracy. So let me ask you all a quick question. If, as you think of what democracy is, and I know that you've spent the last couple days thinking about this a lot and being challenged in some different ways, write down one word that comes to mind when you think of democracy. And I ask you to share it. And it's hard, right? It's only one word. Can somebody throw out, can someone throw out a word that they thought of? Yes, ma'am? Choice. Thank you. Yes? People. Excellent. Sir? Voice. Great. Ma'am? Empowerment. Absolutely. Freedom, for sure. Equitable, thank you. Shared, thank you. Someone over here? I didn't hear that one. Ownership. Sir? Fear. Yeah, I really appreciate that. We're hearing some really positive words when we talk about democracy in general, right? And I think that is like the hope when we talk to folks at IAP2, I think you guys, are, in many senses, are the pioneers of effective democracy, working to solve something, to make it even better. But we often forget why we're doing it. It's because there's an issue, a challenge. And I think that word there, fear, sums it up really well. Maybe two more. Sorry? Fight? Vote. Yeah, that's a good one, right? Obviously. I told you, it's a lot of jet lag up here, yeah. Bureaucratic. Thank you for that as well. So as we think about all of these kind of amazing words that describe democracy, we're also recognizing that there are some real challenges. So in order for us to do something like participatory budgeting and have it work really well, we need to think about ways in which we ensure equity and inclusion. And I'm going to ask you another question in a couple minutes. I'll give you guys a chance to think about it. When we talk about government, who are the people that are left in? Who are the people that are included? And who are the people that are left out? And as I talk about this equity and inclusion component, think about that, because I'm going to ask you to answer that for me in a few minutes. So when we think about participatory budgeting and the way that we implement PB, and I'll just try and say PB because participatory budgeting is a little bit of a mouthful. When we think about how to implement this the right way and focus on equity and inclusion, there are a couple of key components. One is ensuring that we're talking about money that matters, both in size and a portion of a public budget that really affects people. Today I'm going to talk a lot about youth empowerment through participatory budgeting. So we're talking about budgets that affect a school district, a particular school. We're talking about maybe if we're doing a citywide process, maybe it's $1 million, and that's what we did in the city of Boston, that would affect folks. Now, if we had a $5,000 process, wouldn't it be able to accomplish very much? It wouldn't really feel like it was equitable or particularly inclusive, because we wouldn't be able to do very much with that pot of money. So let's also talk about who to include in order to make sure that we reach the right folks. And that really goes back to grassroots leadership. So that means that the community-based organizations, the individuals that are community leaders, tapping into their networks so that we can make sure that the right people are at the table to design this process. And by inclusive design, what I mean here is if we're talking about engaging young people, for example, when exactly should we meet? Could we meet at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday? Probably not, because young people are in school at that time. So being mindful of the target population that we're trying to reach and building a process where we can actually have conversations with those folks in a safe space. In that same vein is leaning on that grassroots leadership and building that inclusive design to make sure that we reach the right folks, that targeted group of people, so that they can be involved in the process. And then last but not least, it's defining equity criteria together. So what does equity mean when we're doing participatory budgeting? And I can't say that that's the same everywhere. A couple weeks ago, I was in Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore is going, I'm sure you guys have seen some of this stuff on the news. When we talk about racial challenges and what that looks like in the United States right now, Baltimore, Maryland is in many respects at the heart of some of this conversation. So defining equity criteria in Baltimore is quite different than that same equity criteria that may take place in Boston. So I asked you guys a question, and that question was, who is left in, right? Who's often included when we talk about democracy and government? And who are the folks, the players that are often left out when we talk about democracy and government? So I'll start with who's left in first. Who's always included? Government, right? It always starts in government in this like think tank or silo, right? Those are the folks that come up with the ideas first. Who else is always included? Businesses, yes. And there's an incentive there too, right? Who else is always included? Sir? The people that are loud, yeah, right? Absolutely. Who's often left out? Who's not included? People that are minorities, and that could be an immigrant population, that could be people of color, that could be a lot of different things. But whoever that minority is, those folks are often left out. Who else? Young people. And I heard the term kids, and I just have to be honest. If I say kids, I feel like the people in Boston will hear me, and then they'll get really angry with me. So I try not to say that, and I also challenge other folks not to say that too. So yeah, folks that are not legally eligible to vote are often left out, and that often includes young people without a doubt. Who else is often left out? People that are introverted, right? So those that are not super loud. Absolutely. Anyone else? Who's often left out? Yes. People with disabilities. And I think about that often. I did a conference once that I put on, and there were 3 individuals that needed sign language interpretation, and there were thousands of folks there, and I said, okay, great, we'll get 1 sign language interpreter, and we had all these breakout sessions, and that didn't quite work. That didn't empower the folks that needed sign. That meant that anyone that needed sign language interpretation could only go to the same sessions together. So it really limited their ability to have a choice, right? And I think that's a lesson that I learned, but one that is very present. So let's talk a little bit about the process in Boston and what that looked like. And I want to go back to this idea of folks that are often left out. Does anyone work with young people here? A couple folks. Who wants to work with young people? A couple more. Who thinks it's hard to work with young people? A few. Who thinks it's easy? Okay. Some people just have no opinion, or they're somewhere in between. That's okay. I'll tell you this. When I facilitate a meeting or a conversation, when I build a lesson plan, when I build anything that involves a group of folks, I build it the same way. There's no youth talk that I give versus an adult talk. It's all the same conversation. And in that same vein, if we were going to go out and build a building, we would get an architect, right? We'd get an expert to do that work for us. And so why not, if we're going to build a program or initiative for young people, why not go and get experts? And that means young people. So it's designing a process and leaning on the expertise of folks that know their peer group. And I mentioned this a couple minutes before I came in to give this talk to you guys. In my work for over a decade with the city of Boston, a lot of my role was to reach young folks. And one of the best social media managers I ever had was Mabel, 17 years old. When I would post on social media, there'd be 2 likes, 5 views, or something like that. When Mabel would post, there would be thousands of likes, even more views. And I would turn to Mabel and say, teach me, how do you do this? And she'd laugh and she'd say, Shari, I just feel it. I just know how to have conversations with my peers. And I said, great. Well, you know what? Let's empower you to do that. Let's have you manage the social media for our department. And we saw great success. So it was that same mind that we were able to launch something like Youth Lead the Change. And before I go on and explain how great it was, there's this really important element, and that's youth leadership. In the city of Boston, we have a long-standing legacy called the Mayor's Youth Council. Do folks here have like a youth commission or youth council where they come from? Great. And for those of you that raised your hand, sometimes is it just like a photo op thing where you just come in and take some pictures and that's pretty much it? Well, that's not what the Mayor's Youth Council is. The Mayor's Youth Council is a group of about 85 young people that come from all over the city of Boston. These are not class presidents, they're neighborhood presidents. These are folks that know community, know how to reach individuals, are parts of various community organizations. Sometimes they come from a challenging background and have experienced a detention facility, or maybe they've been in a gang environment and are no longer in that space. But these are folks that come from all different backgrounds, and they come together for one purpose, and that is to advise the mayor and city leadership on youth-related issues. Not just for a picture, actual work together in a collaborative way. And so as I talk about Youth Lead the Change, I think it's important to understand that this didn't just happen. We didn't just start with Youth Lead the Change. We started with a 20-year-long legacy of engaging young people in real leadership in order to transition to real action. Because not everyone can serve on the Mayor's Youth Council, right? I said it was 85 folks. What about the thousands of other individuals that want to participate in civic engagement in an action-oriented way? I mentioned before that one of the things that we did was build a steering committee in order to make this work well. So when we did Youth Lead the Change in the city of Boston, we thought about the organizations and individuals that needed to be present. We had a kind of cross-section of some different sectors, whether that was cultural organizations, those that focused on civic engagement, maybe there was a public health factor of this organization. Bottom line though, anyone that served on the steering committee had to identify at least 2 young people to represent that organization and make key decisions about how this process would work. Again, if we're going to build a process for young people, we have to have young people engineer that process. And they need to be supported by individuals. And that means creating a safe space for adults, but also creating a safe space for young people to do exactly what they do really well. And so we were able to do quite a bit. But there's this other thing that's just ringing in the back of my head as I'm talking. And so often, in my experience, I hear individuals say that young people are our future leaders. Have you guys heard this before? You're going to lead us at some point in the future. And at this point, from my experience and the work that I've done and the amazing young people that I've had a chance to work with, I've realized that maybe that's not exactly the right thinking. That instead of saying that young people are our future leaders, we really need to think about how young people can lead now, how young people can lead with us today. And that's, again, with support, encouragement, mentorship. And if we're going to build communities that are reflective of generations to come, that means that we need to engage young people in leadership now. And so when we went out in Boston and we did idea collection, we brought this effort to young people. We thought about transit stations, high schools, and we also asked young people, where do we need to be? And when I've done this work in Oakland and Baltimore, the answer to that question is always different. So it's really leaning into that community expertise. I've seen examples of us putting on a show, almost, but really like a talent show, so that folks at the beginning of an idea collection, or sometimes we call them an assembly, have the opportunity to highlight some local talent. We bring in a big crowd, we showcase some of the amazing things that young people are doing, and then we say, how can we make community better? And we've gotten thousands of ideas thinking differently about how we engage community, and that's really youth-driven. Now, the question I get the most is, once you have these thousands of ideas, how do we get them onto a ballot in a way that makes sense? And I'm going to be honest, it's not easy. This means, in my case, we saw young people form different subcommittees. They were called change agents. They work with city staff and other individuals to distill down ideas, put price tags on them, determine what's feasible, what would have the most impact, and where the areas of the greatest need in the city were to identify where projects should be. It was a lot of hard work, but in that process, a lot of two-directional learning takes place. Young people and community members learn how government works. What does it mean to purchase something? And what is the process for that? It's not as easy as walking into a store and picking something up, unfortunately, right? We talked about bureaucracy earlier. And on the same vein, government staff, they really have an opportunity to learn what the spending priorities of community are. They really have an opportunity to learn what matters most in a particular project for community members. So through this, and it's often about 6 to 8 weeks of proposal development, there's a lot of learning and shaping of proposals that takes place. And then is the exciting part that we heard about before, that's the vote. So here is when we go out into community again. We flood the train stations, the basketball games, the schools, and we really think about how do we bring the vote out to the folks that are most difficult to engage, right? The marginalized communities. We lean on that expertise that I mentioned before, that grassroots leadership, but we also think about what are the ways in which our target population communicates? So is that social media? Sure. Does that mean that the greatest group of folks are probably in the public school system? Yes. And so in Boston, we piloted an online voting program where folks that are in Boston public schools were credentialed voters. We knew how old they are. We knew that they were in Boston public schools, and they could submit their vote online. So really looking at every way possible to bring the vote out to folks to make it easy for them to participate. I just want to mention one quick thing. That's my friend, Francesco. Francesco and I grew up together. He oversees the Mayor's Youth Council now that I've transitioned to this role. And what he's holding there is a sign that says, it's a contract. And it says, I, Francesco Tenna, will dye my hair green if we get to 7,000 votes, and it'll be green for a week. I'm still working on getting Francesco's hair green, but those are the kinds of interesting and innovative contests that we have to kind of empower our staff, but really excite our staff to doing things a little bit different. We, as a city staff members, become different, maybe more vulnerable than other folks in city government. Over the course of the last 3 years that we've done Youth Lead the Change, we've collected nearly 3,000 ideas from community. And the interesting thing about this is not every idea is going to be eligible based on the criteria for participatory budgeting. So what happens to the other ideas? I'll give you one quick example. I mentioned I oversaw the employment program, internationally known employment program in the city of Boston. When we collected all of these ideas, a lot of them were about how to make our employment program better. And no, it didn't quite fit into the criteria for spending, but we used Youth Lead the Change to redesign and relaunch our employment program with all sorts of online features and different ways for young people to interact with potential employers. And it was a huge success. Within 1 week of launching, I went to the White House to talk about how we designed our employment program and to share that information with other cities across the United States. So it's not only about the ideas that are collected, but it's about the communication that's happening between residents and government. We saw over 100 folks, change agents, those that are developing proposals, develop 39 projects that made it to the ballot over the course of 3 years. This past year alone, we saw nearly 4,500 folks participate in a vote. Overall, we've seen about 8,600 votes over the course of the life of Youth Lead the Change. And to date, we've actually seen more projects than 15 funded, but we've seen almost 20 projects funded across the city of Boston. And these are not projects that would normally be funded. We're talking about, in some instances, security cameras at a park. We're talking about art walls where artists can canvas their work and another artist can come and do that in a safe space without being penalized or accused of graffiti. We're talking about smart boards in every Boston public high school that's manned by young people for young people so they can get information about jobs, free things to do, you name it. We're talking about a mobile application that will allow a young person to find out about resources, jobs, and opportunities anywhere in the city of Boston. Things that maybe weren't necessarily on City of Boston's radar now were and were voted on by community members through this process. And we learned a lot. One of the things we learned is how important it is to harness technology, but more importantly is to maintain the human elements of our process, Youth Lead the Change. It's so important, this interaction that happens between individuals, and there's no way that it can be replaced by technology, but technology can absolutely enhance it. We also learned that you can't do this overnight, and I think you guys know this in the work that you do. Participation, dialogue, deliberation, democracy, it takes time, and it takes time to do it well. And I heard this before as well, it's that piece of engaging the folks that are often left out, the marginalized individuals, and there were huge gains when we did this. Harvard University did a study on Youth Lead the Change. We learned a couple things. One is that the folks that were more deeply engaged, the individuals that developed proposals, that's the green bar that you see, they saw the highest gains in things like learning about government, feeling confident in their skills, and having a better understanding of community needs. We also saw that folks that participated in this reported that they were more likely to do a couple things, like vote in a local or national election, be engaged in community. So we learned that Youth Lead the Change, participatory budgeting, is not only an exercise in democracy, but it's changing the civic trajectory for the individuals that are involved in it. And so that's a couple of examples of why it matters, but what we're talking about here is real power, real democracy. So often we're asked to give feedback and think about things, brainstorm ideas, but it's often unclear what happens after that. In this instance, it's very clear and we can point to it. We're also talking about examples of, again, folks that are not often eligible to participate in civic or government life that are. So in Vallejo, California, 20% of the folks that voted in their participatory budgeting process were ineligible to vote in regular elections. In New York City, where we see about $38 million that's spent by community, a huge proportion of that is low-income residents, and that's not seen in the regular election cycle. And so essentially, we're building stronger, more empowered communities, folks that now have an opportunity to learn about government, navigate government in a way that wouldn't happen otherwise. So we're talking about dollars and cents, yes, we're spending money. In Boston, it was $1 million that 12 to 25-year-olds voted on. But there's a lot of other things, benefits that are happening here. There's two-directional learning. There's lifelong skill sets that are taking place. But essentially, we're building stronger leaders and incorporating leadership now instead of waiting for the future. And ultimately, the communities that emerge are stronger for it. I mentioned before some of the skill sets that are taking place, and yes, that's public speaking, facilitation. We even created jobs for some of the young facilitators to participate in Youth Lead the Change, and now they're able to add those items to their resumes. Ultimately, and I think the end goal of everything that we do when it relates to participatory budgeting is to create government that is more effective, that is more responsive to community needs, community that is able to communicate with that government, and one that's not so scary, one that is able to react positively to conversations happening in community. And in order for that to happen, we have to be vulnerable. We have to say, we don't have all of the answers, but we're looking forward to working together to solve those. And I think that's what I mean when I think about redefining the way that we practice democracy through participatory budgeting. The last thing that I wanted to mention quickly is PBP is jumping into a couple different spaces, and most recently I've been doing a lot of work on participatory budgeting in schools, and we've just launched a PB in Schools guide. So if folks are interested in learning about participatory budgeting specifically with a youth focus, I think that this is a great resource to take a look at. Not only does it have lessons plans and worksheets, but it kind of shepherds folks through engaging in a PB process, especially with young people. So I'm going to pause there because that was a lot of talking from me. And I would love to hear if you guys have any questions, comments. There may be a microphone coming to you. I can hear you great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Really inspiring. Over here, we've done a few participatory budgets. We tend to use our cornerstone as a random stratified selection. It is fantastic to hear in a conference an experience using the Brazil model.
Yes.
So I'm really curious to hear from you. What do you see as the differences, benefits of having taken this approach versus maybe having gone with a small group, randomly selected? It's just that it's such an interesting experience that we don't hear often here in Australia, so I'm keen.
Yeah, so thank you for mentioning the Brazil model, and yes, this is adapted from this model. And there are a couple things that happen a bit differently in that model. So one is, in order for folks to be able to develop proposals, they have to be elected to be a budget delegate. In this instance, in the way that we practice participatory budgeting, you don't have to be elected. You have to commit to a volunteer commitment, which is time-consuming, and I mentioned that before. But it kind of broadens this pool and allows many folks to participate. And I think that's the major and main difference. Now, we see many examples of participatory budgeting in the States, some that are district-based, that means like a smaller component of a city. A city is made up of several districts, and some that are citywide. In my opinion, the ones that work best are those citywide examples. It's because it challenges government and community to think about areas of need, to talk to residents from different spaces, maybe people that are different from them, and then implement projects, maybe not with the lens of what I need, but instead of through the lens of what's best for a community. Sir?
G'day, thanks for that. I'm actually just interested in the implementation phase of the projects that you're talking about. So we've got the participatory budgeting process, people vote, including young people, and then those projects are then implemented. Is it the city that's implementing them, and how involved are the people who dreamt them up and voted for them in the actual delivery of those projects?
Thank you. So the answer to your question is the implementation phase, in my opinion, is probably the most important. Voting is important, but it doesn't matter if the things that were voted on are not implemented and implemented in the way that they were intended. And so absolutely, folks that worked on those committees, those change agents that developed those proposals, stay engaged throughout the implementation phase. And so some projects take 3 weeks to implement. For example, we delivered laptop computers to several high schools that were in need in the city of Boston. That was quick. But other projects are more time-consuming and require all sorts of different things that are beyond my scope of understanding. But I'll give you one quick example. When we were going to do a park renovation in Franklin Park, an area of Boston, there's a lot of history in Boston, right? People talk about that all the time. As we were getting ready to break ground to build these components of the renovated park, we discovered that we were on top of a historical archaeological site, so we had to pause and do an archaeological dig that we were able to invite community to participate in. We extended the history of Boston, secured the space, and then renovated the park. So that was a totally different implementation experience, but one that not only involved community every step of the way, but was incredibly transparent. And I think that's something that we continue to work on, but is a huge part of doing this and doing it well. Right up here in the front. It's a lot of work trying to pick you guys when you all raise your hand at the same time.
Hi, thank you. I'm really interested in your voting process.
Yes.
It looked like you're running both a paper process and an online process. How rigorous is it? Do you check people, or does it not matter and you can just let multiple people vote? So I'm just interested in the rigour of the voting process, because it could be a huge thing.
You guys are asking good questions. It's like things I forgot to mention you're asking me about, so this was all part of the design. So yes, we credential voters. It's incredibly important to maintain the integrity of the process. So if we're talking about a youth process where anyone can suggest an idea, all sorts of folks can work on developing proposals, but only young people can vote, that means that in truth, we had to kind of reverse card people, which never happens. So if you looked like maybe you were 21, we absolutely asked to see your ID or proof that you were 25 or below. And that never happens, right? So people were pretty shocked about that. When it comes to voting online, I mentioned before, when we did this in Boston Public Schools, people had a school identification number that helped to credential them. So we knew who they were, how old they were, and so forth. The paper ballots had a similar process, but all of the paper ballots were input through our online system, and then if folks had a school ID, they were matched that way. So yes, it's rigorous, yes, it's a lot of work, but it's absolutely important to wrestle with those components of credentialing voters in order to maintain the integrity of the process and to make sure that things aren't happening like double voting, for example. Right up here. I'm coming this way next, okay?
Thank you for your presentation. I guess evaluation is something that is often overlooked, and pretty keen to hear how you guys approach that.
Yeah, so this is great. You guys are asking all the right questions. So when it comes to evaluation, that's something that people really think about at the end of a process, right? Oftentimes, you've gone through something, it's worked out or not, and then you're like, ooh, we should evaluate this. When we do evaluation, though, the way that in which it's effective, and I come from an evidence-based background. My background is in sports medicine, which doesn't always match up, but I think it does, to community participation and engagement. But from this evidence-based background, I learned that doing processes like this, it's important to identify your research partner really early on and to canvas which research partners that would be, to identify your goals and metrics. And that can change or adjust during the process, but to have very clear desired outcomes that you're thinking about at the very beginning of this. So again, skill gain was huge for us. Conversations that we could kind of match and count with government officials, folks that had never walked into City Hall before or any government building that did as a result of Youth Lead the Change. Those are things that we tracked and included as part of evaluation. And the last thing that I would say is it's important that you're not evaluating yourself, but that there is a third-party evaluator that's present to evaluate some of these components. And we found that really helpful. So from year 1 to now we're in year 4, we're starting year 4 of Youth Lead the Change in Boston. But from year 1 to year 4, there have been drastic changes in how we do this, really built off of the evaluation partners and the feedback that we receive, not only from participants, parents, and other folks. So it's really important. Now I'm coming this way, right over here. Oh, here, sorry. And then we're going back there.
Do you have any support mechanisms available for communities that have low literacy, financial literacy, and within the community so that they're more empowered to make a difference?
Yes. So I think there are a couple things. There's financial literacy, and that's how materials are designed. But there's also the really important component of appropriate facilitation. And I think that if we're going to go into a community, right, and in a space that we want people to feel safe and engaged, it's important to have a diverse group of facilitators and folks that can relate to that group of people that you're talking about. So there's a lot of sort of restorative justice, racial justice, and other components that our facilitators need to maintain and also be able to respond in a trauma-informed way when we're out in community. Because when we're talking about this, it can be really triggering. Someone could describe an instance with government that has really impacted them negatively. And I deal with this constantly when I walk into a new space and someone says, I just cannot stand government, and I just really don't trust that this is going to work out and folks are going to do things the way that I intend for them to be done. And so a lot of that work is really overcoming that piece. But just as it relates to financial literacy, it's really about designing materials in an effective way. And I'm going to go back to what I said earlier, and that's including experts. So yes, maybe there are some folks that have designed financial literacy pieces before, but testing that with your steering committee members who are young people, making sure that they understand these materials and are involved in that design process is really important to make sure that those materials come out appropriately. What I think makes sense is not the golden standard. It's what young people think makes sense. So including them in that process is how we do it well. Back here.
Yeah, hi. I was curious about the process of distilling the thousands of ideas into 39 proposals. Not the implementation of the proposals, but the prioritization of the thousands.
So there's a couple different ways that we do this. Item number 1 is once all of the ideas are collected, they pass through the designated city staff member to determine feasibility first. So in the first year that we did this, I think a 9-year-old student in South Boston said, you know what I think we should have? A bacon room. A room made of bacon. How cool would that be? And that wasn't feasible for a few reasons. One, it wouldn't last longer than 5 years, and that's necessary for a capital project, and this was capital funding. And it would probably cost, I don't know, over the unallotted money, but we were able to go back and say this project isn't particularly feasible, but we can think about other interesting uses of bacon. So one is the feasibility pass. So once that happens, then we look at the remaining ideas. And even though certain ideas are not feasible, that doesn't mean that they stop there. That means that they're shot off to the appropriate city department or Mayor's Youth Council Committee for further discussion and potential implementation in other ways. So what happens to the ones that are initially feasible? Well, then we apply something called the idea ranking tool. And the idea ranking tool has 3 major components. 1 is a review of feasibility, 2 is a review of impact, and 3 is a review of need. They're scored based on those criteria. And then sometimes different ideas, you can see that they're very related. So sometimes proposal developers or budget delegates or change agents actually lump those ideas together to create a full proposal. So again, it's a lot of work, but going back to those three main components is feasibility, impact, and community need. Right here. How are we doing on time? I still don't even... How much time do we have? Okay, great. We have enough time for a few more questions.
Okay, I've got two questions. I want to try roll it all into one. The first is, how did you get $1 million?
Good.
And the second is, with the city experts that you referred to, how did you get them, I guess, to buy into this program and to not just go, that's ridiculous, we're not doing it?
What's your name?
Adama.
You are asking the right questions. This is great. So how did we get $1 million? Well, we have a long history, and I said this before, of the mayor of Boston at the time, the late Mayor Menino. Now the mayor is Mayor Martin Walsh. But the late Mayor Menino really believed in youth empowerment. And I can say this honestly, this man partially raised me. I started working in his administration when I was about 14 years old. And so I saw a lot in terms of how he empowered young people. But he heard about participatory budgeting and said, I want to do this and I want to do it differently. I want to engage young people and I really believe in their leadership. Adults get to decide how money is spent all the time. But I think this is something totally different. So he said, I want to put $1 million out there to do this sort of process. So I didn't have to go and get $1 million. He actually identified that pot of money. Now in other instances, it's a little bit different. In a couple examples, we're working with federal funding, and they have a requirement for participation. So we've been able to go and say, well, why don't you consider participatory budgeting as the vehicle to make sure that you maintain or meet your participation requirement for these funds. We've also seen examples where community-based organizations have come together and identified a portion of a budget, and then we've worked collaboratively to institute participatory budgeting based on those findings or that conversation or discussion. So it happens a little bit differently in a couple different ways. And then your second really important question is, how do we get city staff who are really busy and overworked and never grumpy to buy in, take this on, and then maybe some of them have never worked with young people, maybe some of them never want to, and have a really positive experience. And that really starts with leadership and setting a tone in leadership and saying, in this instance, the mayor saying, my expectation is that this happen and that these folks participate and that you're doing it in this way. And then it was up to the facilitators, myself and some of the other staff, who I had relationships with everyone in the city of Boston. I was in leadership, to go to my colleagues and say, this is what I need from you in order for this to be successful, and being very clear and transparent about the expectations, the desired outcomes, the amount of time and effort that this would take, and how we could streamline different things to make it easier. In years 2 and 3, how we got buy-in was listening to that feedback. When folks said, look, we're doing the City of Boston's budget process in the springtime, and it becomes really difficult for us to sit down and have meetings between X date and X date, great. So we'll make some adjustments so that it's not quite so burdensome and so that you guys can participate in the ways in which we hope. So I think it's a lot of adjustment, but really it's setting the expectation. And then the folks that do this, I mean, they're coming out and saying, man, this is great. And one of the things they tell me is, I never knew, wow, these young people are awesome. I just had no idea that they could come up with this great stuff, and they had all this really interesting things to say, and they're so, they're thinking so hard about some of these challenges that we face as a city. And I'm like, well, that's the problem right there, is that folks are really underestimating the value of young people participating. So taking this asset-based approach really changes that narrative and changes the city staff members that are involved in this process. And you guys that are raising your hand really fast are winning, because...
So participatory budgeting involves fractions of budgets. Have you ever had experiences where during the process people challenge the way that the rest of the budget is spent?
Of course. Absolutely. I think that's one of the major draws for participatory budgeting is because people are unhappy or confused or don't understand how elements of the budget are spent without question. So again, when we talk about participatory budgeting, $1 million of the city of Boston's entire capital budget is not that much money. It's a very small percentage, but more than the dollars and cents that's taking place, people are learning how to navigate government, how decisions are being made, who's making those decisions, who we can collaborate with, and how we do things better. So it's more about opening channels for dialogue and communication that weren't there before. It's a two-directional learning experience and in democracy that happens, and I think, yes, folks challenge other elements of the budget, and yes, there's an opportunity for us to address those, even outside of what we're talking about when we say PB.
Have you ever faced unfair or incorrect accusations from stakeholders outside the process, say media or political candidates, particularly in relation to being seen to be influencing or brainwashing young people?
Yes, right? So,
or just aspersions cast on the program, and how have you dealt with that?
So in the first year of participatory budgeting, so I just want to mention this again. So I'm born in Slidell, Louisiana, lived in Boston for about 20 years. Everybody in Boston knows me. I've done every youth program. I work with 250 youth organizations. This is the work that I do. My expertise is in engaging young people. When I first walked into a community center, the first year we did this, and I said, guys, I have $1 million on the table and I need you to tell me how to spend it. The first thing they said was, I don't believe you. And I'm like, it's me. And they were like, Shari, I don't believe what you're saying. This money is going to be spent the same way that all the money is spent, and the businesses are going to come in and they're going to do this, that, and the third, and it's never going to work out. And I said, well, that's why I need you to make sure that that doesn't happen. I need your partnership, your collaboration to build this process so that that can't happen, so that we are incredibly transparent, so that every idea has the same chance of making it through. And I can't define all of that. I need your expertise, your experience to make sure that your biggest fears don't happen when we do participatory budgeting the right way here in Boston. And now, when I start processes all over the country, that's the same lens that we use. So yeah, there is this very real fear of the process not meeting that equity criteria. There is this very real fear of someone asked me an interview question the other day, and they said, what about trolls that come in and troll the process and mess things up? And I said, that's a possibility. But I think, again, it's how we prepare, how we build a process, how we think through the various elements of how participatory budgeting are going to work that makes sure that the way that this is intended to happen, this empowerment through democracy, is actually what takes place. Sure.
Thanks, Shari. Brilliant work, well done.
Thank you.
I love the trade show type event, you know, when they're selling the ideas and presenting the ideas. And it's a bit of a follow-up to what you were just saying. Some of the ideas don't get through. How does that impact on the community? I can imagine there's a lot of passion around it. You're doing it annually. You know, how do you follow through on that relationship or the kind of disappointment you're dealing with?
Well, I think, again, it comes back to transparency. So it's not like I chose which ideas made it or didn't. Community did. And so that there are ideas that, one, don't make it onto the ballot, and there are also things that make it onto the ballot that don't get voted on. There is an opportunity for those things to be suggested again. So there are times that we see ideas that have made it onto the ballot in more than 1 year. And I think it's also a chance to ignite people's kind of passion in owning this process, because if you're really passionate about seeing some change happen, maybe it's a specific project, or maybe it's just an area and community that's underdeveloped or hasn't received a lot of resources, it's a chance for you to champion that, organize some folks around it, and then see an actual and real result. And there's not a lot of examples in government that I've seen where that's real and can actually happen. So we go out in community and do forums, but to be able to point to this particular thing is really what I want to do is incredibly important. How other ways that we keep people involved that may be disappointed in the outcome is really thinking about, and I showed you this slide before that said the biggest gains were for folks that were more deeply involved in the process. So we ask, what ways would you like to be involved next year? This year, maybe you just voted, but next year, maybe you want to work on a proposal development team. And maybe you want to facilitate some sessions. And so I think it's really finding ways for different folks to legitimately own the process and then to maintain transparency through every step. So we're not just secretly deciding what's eligible and not. We're being incredibly transparent about that. I think I have time for like one more question. Okay. Simon.
Thanks, and I'm glad you followed me rather than the other way around. It's been great, thanks. So one thing that I brought up in my talk was that a number of our bits of work are quite fragile as people move on. And you talked about the first mayor and then the change in mayor. How fragile is this, and how do you try and make sure that it's properly embedded in the work of the city and beyond?
So I think one of the things that's important is institutionalizing this process. This wasn't my brainchild, but I did a lot of the legwork to make this happen and developed an entire division within government that has done a lot of this work and then left that division in great and capable hands. But some of the things that I did before I left was when we first started Youth Lead the Change, we had a contract with the organization I work for now, the Participatory Budgeting Project. And that contract was, I don't know, about somewhere close to $100,000. And they were supposed to provide technical assistance and the framework for how this would work. Because to be honest, it takes a lot to understand how participatory budgeting is going to work and to do it really well. And so that was great, and we figured it out during the first year. It took me about a couple months to actually figure out what this is supposed to look like, and that's just being really candid. And then in the next year, our contract was smaller. We said, well, we have this part of it figured out, and maybe you could just help us with these other components. And then by the third year, it was even smaller. Now, it may just be a very small contract, but that's kind of the mission of the Participatory Budgeting Project, is so that governments, institutions, organizations can really make this a part of the way that they do work, really make this a part of the way that they practice democracy and empower communities, so that they're taking it on, they're infusing it in their own institution, and then we're able to step out. And that helps to really alleviate the fragility that you're mentioning. And so yes, there are examples when it hasn't worked out really great, and those have been the examples where we couldn't get a pathway to institutionalize this sort of process, but in instances where we have, it's been incredibly successful and very much thriving. You guys, thank you all for your time and your attention. I really appreciate it. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. My name is Shari Davis. I'll be in town for a couple more days. Thank you guys so much.